Shailaja. I'm from the Zoho CRM team that handles developer documentation exclusively. So I'll be handling today's presentation. So let me just begin by sharing the presentation deck with you. As Charles said, this is the Zoho CRM Developer Series. This is the second one in the series. So in today's session, we'll be discussing the Python SDK and the API credit system. So this is going to be the agenda for today. So the first one will be Python SDK. We'll be discussing the Python SDK in length, and then we'll move on to the API credits, how credits are calculated, how concurrency is applied for different APIs. Now, coming to the first one, SDK. The acronym stands for Software Development Kit. Now, I'm sure there are many developers over here who, develop applications, and in order to do so, they need, a set of tools like compilers, debuggers. So all this comes as a package, and it is called an SDK. So SDK has all the required tools for a developer to develop an application. So in Zoho CRM, we have multiple SDKs. We have server-side SDKs, client-side SDK, iOS and Android SDKs. So in server-side SDK, we have Java, Python, C#, PHP, Node.js, Scala, TypeScript, and Ruby. So depending on your application, you can choose one of the SDKs over here. Now, any SDK, it acts as a middleware between Zoho CRM and the client application. So similarly, the Python SDK for Zoho CRM, it acts as a middleware for your client application to use data that is there in Zoho CRM. So because Python SDK for Zoho CRM is available, it makes it very, very easy for you to integrate your application with Zoho CRM and then use data that is there in Zoho CRM. And SDKs act as a wrapper for REST APIs, which means all the CRM entities, all the CRM resources, be it modules, fields, etc., they're available as classes. So it's just basically a method call for you to execute the APIs. And then another major advantage of using an SDK is automatic token handling, which means you just have to generate the grant token once, after which the SDK takes care of generating access token, refresh token, and then refreshing the access token every hour. So all that is taken care of by the SDK. Now, for you to use any SDK for that matter, you need to have a proper environment. So for Python SDK specifically, we recommend that your application have Python version 3 or above, and you must use this pip command to install Zoho CRM as a package. So the package name is Zoho CRM SDK 6_0. This is the latest package that we have for Python SDK, which uses the version 6 APIs. So you can use the pip command to install our SDK. Now, how to start using the Python SDK? Okay, so you are developing your application, you want to use our SDKs. So your application, the ultimate aim of your application is to use data that is there in Zoho CRM. So in order to do that, you must have to register yourself, your application as a client in Zoho CRM. And then once your application is registered, you have to install the SDK, import the SDK in your project, and then initialize it. And then you can start making API calls through the SDK using the available methods. So let's just see this in detail. Registering your application. Now, essentially, the SDK also makes API calls. So Zoho CRM APIs, they are authenticated using the OAuth 2.0 protocol. So OAuth 2.0 protocol is the industry standard protocol that we have for authenticating the APIs. So we have spoken about it in length in our last session. So you can refer to the video, and then you have to choose your client type. So because Python SDK is essentially a server-side SDK, you have to choose your client. You have to register yourself as a self-client or a server-based client. So let me just show it to you. So this is the Zoho API console, https://api-console.zoho.com. So here I'm going to add client. So for simplicity's sake, today I'll just go with the self-client flow because it's easier. So now I'm going to create a client of the self-client type. So now when you see, I've created a self-client. I have my client ID and client secret over here. So client ID and client secret need to be maintained, very protectively. So we recommend that you use it with caution, because when client ID and client secret is, leaked, there is a chance of data breach. So now I have created a client. So I have now registered myself as a client in Zoho CRM. Now, so next is the installing the SDK and importing the SDK in your project. So now, for simplicity's sake, let's just say I have the PyCharm ID here. So we just I'll just explain it through the PyCharm ID. So okay, so here I'm creating a new project. So this is going to be the project. This is the location. I'm creating a project, and now I have to install the SDK. So here, coming to the project. So as you can see, pip is already installed as a package. Now I have to import our SDK. So I'm just searching for Zoho CRM. You can see the different SDKs that are available. So Zoho CRM SDK. Now I'm going to install this package. Yeah. So as you can see, with the Zoho CRM SDK package, the other dependent packages are also installed. So coming here, so I now have the Zoho CRM SDK installed in my project. So now I have imported the SDK. Coming to initialization. Now the SDK has to have a set of information for it to be able to make API calls. So the important factors are you have to give the SDK an environment, you have to give it the token, and you have to give it the store and then the logger. So what each of these mean? Now environment. As many of you know, we have the production environment, we have the sandbox environment, and we also have the developer environment. So depending on which environment you want to create your application and create the tokens in, that environment will have to be passed to the information about that environment will have to be passed to the SDK. Next is token. So in token variable, you have to give your client ID, your client secret, and then the grant or the refresh token. So client ID and client secret we just received when we registered our application as a client in API console. Next is store. So I said CRM APIs are authenticated using the OAuth 2.0 protocol, which means essentially every API call must be authenticated using an access token. So you need to generate a grant token first, and then through that grant token, you'll generate access and refresh tokens. So every API call must have the access token in its authorization, which means the SDK has to be able to store these tokens somewhere for it to be able to make API calls. So that is where the store comes into play. So this store will have the path of the file where you want the SDK to store the tokens. So we have different persistence methods. We have file persistence, we have DB persistence, and we also have custom persistence. Next comes the logger. So the logger is to log exception and other API information. Token persistence. Like I said, the SDK has to be able to save tokens somewhere so that it can refresh the tokens on need basis and then use those tokens when you're making method calls. So like I said, we have MySQL persistence, we have file persistence, we also have DB persistence. Generating tokens. Okay, first I'll just show you the initialization file. So in the Zoho CRM SDK, all the samples and methods are available in our GitHub repository. So in GitHub repository, this is the latest SDK. So here I have the README file where I have the initialization. So all you have to do is just copy this code, come to PyCharm, create a new file. So I'm going to name it as init because this is going to hold all the initialization information. So as you can see, I talked about all the variables. So there is logger, there is environment, there is token, there is store. So because for this example, I'm going to be using the file persistence method. So I'll just use this. And this is for the DB persistence, where you have the host name, database name, username, password, the port number where your server runs on, the table name. So because we are going to use the file persistence today, I'll just remove this. And then configuration. So this variable will hold all the configuration information about the SDK, like auto refreshing, pick list validation, connection timeout, and read timeout. And then if you want your API calls to be routed through a proxy server, then you can use this variable and give the proxy server's details. So right now, I don't need them. So I'm just removing these statements. So here I'm going to be passing the environment, token, store, SDK configuration, not the resource path. and not the proxy details. So this is my initialization file. Okay, so again in token, so you can see there is client ID, client secret, and we have the grant token, refresh token, redirect URI, and the ID. So essentially I'm using self client today, so there will not be a redirect URI. So I'm removing this. I don't even have an ID. And then I'm going to be giving a grant token. So I don't have the refresh token also. So I'm going to be generating access and refresh tokens through the grant token. So as you can see, this is my initialization file. So I'll just save this. Now we'll fill up with details for client ID and client secret. So coming to the API console. So client ID and client secret are here. So I'll just fill that up. Client ID, my client secret, and then the grant token. So for generating grant token, you should be, you should have the list of scopes ready, which means, let's say you have Zoho CRM.modules.all. It means your application will access all data of all the modules that are there in CRM. For example, if you give Zoho CRM.leads.read, which means that means your application will only be able to read data from the leads module in Zoho CRM. So I have a list of scopes already here. I'll simply just give them here. So the time duration is 10 minutes, which means the grant token that I'm generating here will only be valid for 10 minutes, which means under 10 minutes, I have to generate access and refresh tokens from this grant token. So this is going to be the scope description. As you can see, I have different orgs in different environments. So this is the production environment, sandbox, and developer environment. So I'm going to be creating tokens for the production environment. So this is the grant token. So this is valid only for 10 minutes. So this is the grant token. So I have the grant token here, and I generated for the production environment. So this is production, and my data center is US. So it is US data center. In case your data is in the EU data center, you can give the relevant details over here. In case it is sandbox, you can change it to sandbox. So this is done. Now I have generated my grant token, and then I have to generate my access and refresh tokens. Now, generating tokens. Yeah, like I said, from a grant token, you'll be able to generate access and refresh tokens. So every API call that you make must be authorized using the access token. Now, connecting to Zoho CRM. Okay, so like I said, I have given the grant token. Now, SDK will generate access and refresh tokens using this grant token automatically. Now, let's just try and run this file. I'll just I'll just try to create a record. So over here in our GitHub README, you can find an example for create record. So yeah, this is a sample code. So I'll just copy this, and now I'm going to create another file here. I'm going to rename it as create record, pasting it. So yeah, so for the initializer, this is the class which calls the method. So I'm going to just copy this, and I'm going to use this in my create record. So here I'm going to call the initializer class. And now I'm going to be creating a record in the leads module. Okay. So I have already used the initializer class, so I don't need this. Next is this is the method for creating a record. And then, as you can see, I have different fields here with the values. So I'm going to give data to the last name, first name, company, city, and annual revenue fields. So in case you want to add value to any other field, I'll just add value to the field in the leads module. So you can use the dot notation, and you can see the different fields that are available in the leads module. So I'll just go for email opt-out, which is nothing but a Boolean field. So for this, the value is going to be true. So as you can see, for the email opt-out field, the value is going to be true. So here, when you see initializer, it needs an import statement. So I'm going to use it, and you can see the import statement over here. So I'm just saving this, and I'm going to now. Like I said, when you generate tokens, your application or your project needs to have a file, file where you can store all the tokens. So here, this is going to be the file where I'm going to store my tokens. So here I have to give the project path. So here I have to copy the path, and then I have to give it here, and I'm going to name it as tokens.txt. And then similarly for log, you need to have a file for log where you can store your logs for you to be able to see the API execution. And so let's just try and save and run this, the create record file. So I've saved this. I'm going to run this. Since this is the first time I'm initializing the SDK, it might take a few seconds for the response to appear. So here you can see under tokens, you can see the ID, the username that generated the token, and the org ID of the user, the client ID, client. Okay, so you can see the tokens.txt file is created, the log file is also created, and then this has the ID, the username that generated the token, along with the org ID, the client ID, client secret, and I have the refresh token, access token, which is generated using this grant token, and the expiry time. So this expiry time denotes the expiry time of the access token, which means the access token is valid for an hour since it was generated. So this will be the expiry time, and then is the API domain. So this is going to be the API domain through which the SDK will make calls to Zoho CRM. So before this API time, the SDK will automatically generate new access token from the refresh token. So initialization is a one-time process. So once you initialize the SDK, it is enough, and then the SDK will take care of token generation by itself. So it makes it the entire process pretty much easier. So as you can see, I created a record, and then I have the response here. So this is going to be the ID of the record that was recently created. So I have a success response here, and this is the ID of the record that was created. So in our GitHub, we have different samples. So you can go through them and you can use them in your project to try the SDK. Now, credits. So now every API call that goes through has to be accounted for, has to be metered somewhere, right? So this is where credits come into play. So each edition of CRM, depending on the number of user licenses purchased, will have a set number of credits for that account. So all API calls are metered through credits. So every edition, like I said, will have a credit limit, will have a maximum credit limit. And this credit limit follows a 24-hour rolling window, which means, let's say your first API call originated at 8 a.m. in the morning, then your 24-hour lasts between 8 a.m. this morning and 8 a.m. the next morning. So like I said, limits are based on edition and the number of user licenses purchased. So now let's see how this credits are calculated. Now, let's say the credit limit for your account is 5,000 and the time zone is IST. For simplicity's sake, we use this. Now, the first API call is at 8 a.m. And then this has consumed 500 credits, which means the account is left with 4,500 credits. Now, I'm making another API call at 12 noon, and this has consumed 1,500 credits, which means I'm left with 3,000 credits. Similarly, there's another API call at 6:30 in the evening, which consumes 100 credits. Now I'm left with 2,900. Now there's another call at 9 p.m. and it consumes 2,000 credits, which means I'm left with another 900 credits. Now there's one at 11:30 in the night, which consumes all 900 available credits, which means now my account is left with 0 credits. Now, let's say this at 2 a.m. there's another API call. Now, because I'm not left with any credits, I will not be able to make this API call. So this will return an error. Now, what happens next? The rolling window started at 8 a.m. So it is 8 a.m. the next morning, which means the 500 credits that were consumed at 8 a.m. the previous morning will be released here, which means these 500 credits will again be available for me over here. So now my edition will have 500 credits. my account will have 500 credits. Now, under 500 credits, I'll still be able to make API calls. Similarly, at 12 noon the next day, I'll be having another 1,500 credits. So, which means I'll be left with 1,980 credits. So, this is how the rolling window progresses. So, again, at 1830, the 100 credits that were consumed will again be credited back to my account. So, all the credits as the time goes on, they'll be added back. So, this way, your credit limit will be still under 5,000 and you'll still have a rolling window of 24 hours. So this is how the rolling window works, and this is how credits are calculated. Now, concurrency. We talked about making API calls. Let's say concurrency means the number of API calls that can be active concurrently at a given point in time. So every edition, concurrency limit is edition based, and so it is, like I said, edition based. So let's just see how concurrency limit is applied. So here, for simplicity's sake, let's just say the concurrency limit for my account is 10, which means I'll be able to make 10 concurrent requests at any point in time. So now I have a request at time 1. So the concurrency limit is 9 because there's one concurrent request. Again, there's a request at time 2, which means the number of concurrent requests will be 2. Similarly, I have 9 concurrent requests here. Now I have a 10th request coming in, so my concurrency limit will be 10, which means it is at maximum capacity. Now I'm making another 11th request. Because my concurrency limit is only 10, my 11th request will not go through, which means there can only be, the concurrency limit is 10, which means there can only be 10 active API calls at a given point in time. So my 11th request will return an error. And now, so after this P5 request is served, my concurrency limit will be 9, which means I can still be able to make one more request concurrently. So the 12th request will go through because my concurrency is still under the limit for my org. Now, subconcurrency. We talked about concurrency, which means the number of active calls that can be active at a given point in time concurrently. Now, there are some intensive operations like converting leads, getting records with CVID, which means a custom view, getting records from a custom view, inserting, updating, or upserting records that have more than 10 records in a single API call. So these are intensive operations. So we apply something called subconcurrency on these APIs also. So let's say you're making a convert lead API call. So when you're making that, you will have 2 limits applied. One will be the concurrency, which is the base concurrency, and the other one will be the subconcurrency. So the subconcurrency for all the editions is at 10, which means we have a set of APIs for which subconcurrency will be applied, which means if you're using those requests, those APIs, you can make 10 of those requests concurrently, provided it is under your concurrency limit for your application. So we've come to the end of our slide.